Hello and welcome to the Week in 60 Minutes, brought to you by SpectatorTV and broadcast on Thursday the 15th of February. I'm James Heale, the Spectator's political correspondent and your host for this week. Coming up on the show. In this week's politics column, I write about Rishi's roadshow, the plan to get the PM in front of voters to win them over. Could they just end up disliking him more? Natasha Clark and James Johnson will join me later today. Douglas Murray writes his column this week about the newly published honours list. Anyone can get into the Lords these days, he says. We'll discuss that later. Is NATO ready for a Russian invasion? Max Jeffery writes this week's cover piece on the Estonian war games preparing NATO for conflict. He'll be on the show with Jon Foreman. Are Kyivians tiring of their war with Russia? I'll speak to Owen Matthews. And finally, why are Italian restaurants in Britain so bad? Julie Bindel will be on the show to discuss more. Before we get going, if you enjoy Spectator TV, do subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon so you never miss another episode. In this week's politics column, I write about Number 10's plan to get the British people to like Rishi Sunak. A roadshow. Put the Prime Minister in front of voters, they think, and they'll see how great he is. Will it work? I'm joined now by LBC's political editor Natasha Clark and James Johnson, co-founder of JL Partners. Now, Natasha, you've been at some of these PM Connect events. What would you say they're like, and what is Rishi Sunak's strategy when dealing with members of the public?
Yes, I think having seen some of the PM Connect events up front, I think the risk for Number 10 is that they can come across as a little bit awkward, a little bit stilted. I think in previous times, I remember going to an IKEA in Dartford with the PM a few months ago. It came across as just that, a little bit awkward with some of the people that were there and some of the guests that he was trying to impress. He kind of risked coming across as a little bit too down to earth, a bit too, I'm your friend, I'm your mate, Rishi Sunak, don't worry, I get you. But I think the last one in Preston came across as a little bit better. He sort of rolled his sleeves up and had a little bit more of a relaxed atmosphere. He had everybody sort of standing up around him, the cameras, lots of bright lights, and it felt a bit more like an actual event. They held it at a football club, at Accrington Stanley Football Club up in Preston. I think that one went down with the voters a little bit better. I think he came across as a little bit more engaged and tried to sort of step back from a few of his rehearsed lines. But what Number 10 obviously have been doing in the past few weeks with these PM Connect events is road testing some of the lines that they think might work. You know, we saw the back to square one argument being rolled out again, and we saw some of the Prime Minister's attacks on Keir Starmer being road tested. And I'm sure as we come up to the election, some of these PM Connect events will be happening more and more, both with journalists in the room and without.
James, I mean, I've been talking to some Tory MPs who express concern perhaps around Rishi Sunak's political instincts or lack thereof. What do you make of this strategy to get Rishi Sunak out meeting lots of voters? On the one hand, he's probably more popular than his party, but also he's pretty poor rankings in the prime ministerial stakes as well.
So the really important thing that when it comes to political strategy and putting a leader or a prime minister out is to do it for the reasons they are popular, for the reasons that voters like them. Now, the reason when you really dig in to why people like Rishi Sunak, because frankly, there's not many of them at the moment, is a sense of seriousness, is a sense of competence, and a sense that he's quite clever, that he's quite on the ball. Sending Rishi Sunak around the country to get that impression across, behind a podium, giving frank answers, being, serious and straightforward with voters, great. That doesn't appear, though, to be what Number 10 are doing. And instead, we've sort of got Rishi Sunak bouncing around, abseiling, fist bumping, grinning, ear to ear. I don't think those are his strong points. And, in the focus groups that we do, we hear voters say, especially in our monthly radio focus groups, we hear voters say, I don't want you to be chummy. They feel that creates a divide between them and Rishi. They feel it means that he's not in touch. So if I were Number 10, yeah, great, get the PM out there, but you have to do it in ways that resonate with the brand values that voters like. And at the moment, the grinning and the smiling is backfiring rather than helping him. If I were Number 10, I'd ban the smiling, get Rishi Sunak behind a podium. That's when they like him, not when he's grinning from ear to ear.
I mean, Natasha, James there talks about the inherent benefits of being in office. You get the kind of bully pulpit, you get the great trappings of the state, you get to stand in Number 10 behind a podium, can be the office of the Prime Minister. You're not just another party leader at times, you are Britain's representative on the world stage. Is there perhaps a danger, we're expecting to see lots more of this kind of stuff, with Rishi Sunak doing different media formats, perhaps of Number 10 overexposing the Prime Minister and kind of cheapening that as a result, and making him, frankly, as James says there, seeing a bit flippant, glib, at the same time as stressing a message about the importance of economic security and the challenges facing the nation at this difficult time?
I think that is a risk for Number 10, and I think what they want to do is just try and get him out, obviously, in front of as many voters as possible. And I'm not surprised to sort of hear that he's going to be on the road most weeks and sort of leave some more of the sort of foreign policy handshaking and diplomacy abroad to David Cameron. I think that makes sense, and I can understand why Number 10 are wanting to take that approach. They believe genuinely that the more people see of Rishi Sunak, the more they like him. And they say that essentially if that means that he's got to press as much flesh and shake as many hands as possible between now and the election, that's what they're going to do. So some of the things that they want to see him do, we saw that interview with GB News that he did just the other day where he was in a room full of undecided voters. I think we can expect to see much more of that from the Number 10 team as they try and get him over. And I think they will point to that as a win. They will point to the fact that around 50% of those undecided voters decided after seeing him speak that they did like him. And I think that will be something that they'll be thinking about. But obviously with that comes big risks. We saw in the Piers Morgan Talk TV interview, when he made that bet, that really backfired on him. And obviously there are real big risks about going out on the road, meeting loads of voters. You saw what happened with the Sky News clip, which appeared to have been slightly selectively clipped when the Prime Minister met with someone and was talking about the NHS, and it went viral for all the wrong reasons, despite what actually might have happened in that situation. So the more that does happen, the more it does mean that voters will be able to get out and see the real Rishi Sunak. But it obviously creates a huge element of risk for Number 10, and they will be doing all they can to try and make him seem this normal guy. And obviously that's an attack that Labour will say, he doesn't understand you, he's too rich, he doesn't get it. The whole cost of living aspect will come into that, but the more element of risk it will have for some of those potentially Gordon Brown-esque Biggotgate moments, more of them will be at risk of happening if they do go out on the road and do more of these events.
James, I'm fascinated by this notion that if you meet the candidate, you'll like them more. Surely the danger is that, in this election, around the world as well, there's a danger that you meet the candidate and walk away thinking, actually, he didn't shake my hand, he didn't answer my question, I didn't warm much to him, and they could actually be put off him, if anything else.
Yeah, I'm going to sound quite rude to Rishi Sunak here, but if what Natasha is saying is right about that judgment from Number 10 about that people like him after they've seen him, I think they've gone mad. If this is the happy grinny I'm your best mate Rishi Sunak, who shaking hands for the bet, laughing along with a voter when she's trying to ask a serious question about the NHS, then this is going to backfire. I'm not just deciding that's what the voters are telling us in our opinion research. So, look, I think at the GB News event, there's a clip of Rishi Sunak at that GB News event where he's talking about Keir Starmer, and he's talking about, what he'd be like in power. And it's a very, very effective clip. He's not smiling once, by the way. He's just saying it how it is, and he's being serious, and he's lowering with voters. That's very good, but that's not the Rishi Sunak we see a lot of the time. So stop trying to be their best mates is the advice I give to Rishi Sunak, because that seriousness can work. It reminds me a little bit of a focus group about Keir Starmer that I did way back in May 2021. It was a voter who was sat there. I've told this story a couple of times. His name was Steve, I think. And Steve was saying about Keir Starmer, and he said, I'll tell you what, though, I have seen that Keir Starmer's been out and about a bit recently, sleeves rolled up, walking down the streets. And I thought, okay, is he going to say that this is a positive? And I said, well, what do you think about that, Steve? And he said, just be yourself, mate. Just put your tie back on. I don't want to see, this person that you're not. And it is worth noting that, the Keir Starmer we see may have reflected on Steve's comments. He's much more sort of, buttoned up, tie on, doing those statements down the camera with flags behind him. I think Rishi Sunak needs to take the same advice. Voters see through this stuff very, very easily, and he needs to be very careful if he's out on the campaign trail.
Yeah, Natasha, let's talk about Keir Starmer, because, of course, he was elected. Part of that was slightly overshadowed by the beginning of the pandemic in March, April 2020, when he became Labour leader. He's obviously had a very successful set of local election results last year. The Labour by-election machine is a lot better, and as James says, there's some voters who like him when he's much more prime ministerial in this image. A lot of the sort of senior Tories I've been speaking to think that actually, when you make it a contest between Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer rather than Rishi Sunak and an imaginary preferential candidate, voters will compare that negatively for Keir Starmer. They think he's a bit robotic, according to the Tories. They think that he's not going to be able to improvise and he will come apart on the road. And they point to things like, the last week or so, we've seen two big issues Labour fall short on, the 28 billion spending plan and then the debacle over Rochdale. Do you think perhaps that Labour are conscious of this and are willing to send Keir Starmer out more? Or are they determined to keep, as sort of James was saying there, him quite buttoned up, happy to look more prime ministerial at a time when Rishi Sunak is rolling up his shirt sleeves and going around the country and, in James's words, grinning at voters?
Yeah, I think obviously the last week we've seen Labour hiding away in the wake of the Rochdale by-election storm, and I'm wondering if that is an indication of things to come from Labour. Obviously they've got so much more to lose than the Conservatives right now, so they're not putting quite as many candidates up on the airwaves this week as we broadcasters might expect, and I wonder if that's going to be a sign of things to come. Obviously we did see Keir Starmer come out and do a poll clip, but it looked very forced, it felt a little bit scripted. He sort of repeated the answer that he'd given. I don't think he was even expecting the question, well, actually, who should people vote for in Rochdale either? So I didn't feel like he came across amazingly well there either. So actually, it's a bit of a case of maybe damned if they do and damned if they don't. And I think that obviously for Sir Keir Starmer, I think he, the more people see of him now, the riskier that becomes in a way, because Labour are doing so well. So there is a risk that people see him and then actually go, oh, maybe he isn't as great as I thought. And at LBC, we're always listening to what our callers are saying to us, and you do get lots of people phoning in that are sort of saying, yeah, okay, I don't like the Conservative Party, but I'm not sure about Sir Keir Starmer. And actually, I don't know if there is polling on this, James, and what happens if more people see of Sir Keir Starmer, whether they do like him or not. But I think what the Conservatives will be trying to exploit out of the Labour Party is that people aren't quite sure of him. There was one caller we had on earlier today in the wake of the U-turn that really, they weren't bothered about the anti-Semitism scandal, but they were bothered about what it meant for Keir Starmer as a leader. They thought that it showed that he was not a man of conviction, that he couldn't be trusted and that he couldn't stick to his word, and then essentially what that meant for him as Prime Minister and leader. And what Labour really need to remember is that they are going to be making these decisions in government day in, day out, and they have to be getting them right. And at the moment, Sir Keir Starmer in the last week has got what some people would argue two really big decisions quite wrong.
James, what does the polling say then?
Well, one thing that we've seen repeatedly in our focus groups in particular is that people will criticise Rishi Sunak, they'll be very frustrated with him, very angry, and then we'll move on to Keir Starmer and they'll say exactly the same. So there is a weakness to the Labour lead. If there's one poll this week's by Savanta saying that the Labour lead had come down significantly, we'll see whether that's maintained. If it is maintained and the Labour lead does slip, then we kind of knew this might happen already because those views towards Starmer are so negative. And honestly, they sound just like Natasha's caller. They talk about flip-flopping, they talk about no principles, they worry he hasn't got a plan, they worry he's just in this to become PM rather than to actually get anything done. So I do think that is going to have a role come the election. And Natasha makes the spot on point that they're going to have to be making these decisions in government all the time. They're also going to have to be making these decisions in the short campaign all the time when voters are really tuning in. And if I can sort of say this without sort of twitching and having a relapse on camera, if you think back to the 2017 election, Theresa May's social care U-turn, that might not have been a big issue in the day-to-day of government. But in that campaign, lots of people tuning in, people making their mind up about who to vote for, it really, really mattered. If we see Starmer make a blunder like he has with Rochdale this week in the campaign, then that could matter even more so. Maybe they'll learn the lesson. But yes, absolutely, I think that even if Rishi Sunak has his own serious problems, a spotlight on Starmer is absolutely the right political strategy for the Conservatives, because that is the weak underbelly of Labour support at the moment, their own leader.
And as a final question, just want to ask, in writing this article this week, I was struck by the number of people who publicly and privately in the Tories were insistent on the fact that they're sticking to this 80-20 strategy of keeping 80 of their marginal seats already Tory held and trying to target a further 20 gains at the next election. Despite polling suggesting this week, there's an MRP poll out for the Mirror suggesting the Tories could lose 3/4 of their seats. There's one on the Telegraph last month suggesting the Tories could lose half their seats. James, how likely is it that Conservatives make gains at this election?
Well, it's just not going to happen. But also, the parties have to say this. They have to pretend that there's some form of gaining. So I'd be interested to see whether the resources that CCHQ really do allocate in the campaign itself match that. I expect probably not.
Natasha?
Yeah, I think obviously we've seen in the by-elections this week, I don't think CCHQ were putting much resource into either Wellingborough or Kingswood, and feeling that those seats were lost, like expectation management was very much lowered from the Conservative Party. So this does appear to be an interesting strategy, like you say, and I hadn't heard that was still something that they were considering. But I think there is some talk within the party about where they can best place their resource. And obviously we've had a bit of talk about whether Boris will come back and help with some of the, Red Wall seats or the London seats as well, which obviously are at risk of very much of falling even more than they already have in some of those city areas. But I think having Lord Cameron sort of focus on more of the sort of southern seats and people trying to, bat back the Lib Dems is not a bad strategy to have. And that's probably a strategy that Rishi Sunak feels comfortable with. But like I say, is it maybe just a case of, like you say, trying to put a bit of bravado, put a bit of spin on it to say that we've got it, we're still in the fight, we're still in the game, rather than actually a sort of serious political strategy for the election.
Thank you, Natasha. Thank you, James. Thank you for joining us on Spectator TV. In his column this week, Douglas Murray writes about the new honours list. Anyone can get a gong now, he says, apart from Nadine Dorries. Where did the Lords go wrong, and would Douglas turn down a peerage? He joins me now. So, Douglas, there's a new honours list out. What did you make of it?
Well, as I say in the piece, James, I expected by the time it went to press that probably you've now been elevated to the House of Lords. You can tell me during the course of this interview if you've had that happy news. It's really just the observation that whenever I leave the UK and come back, every time I come back, there's another honours list. And the quality of the peers seems to me to be ever diminishing. As I say in the piece, there's every reason to have an upper house, a legislative chamber, which oversees legislation, looks through bills, but comes at it with forms of expertise and types of expertise that maybe don't exist in the House of Commons. Yet what we see with the latest honours list is yet more people being put into the House of Lords who are simply political functionaries. In several cases, people who simply never made it to the House of Commons. Now, there's a good reason that if you've distinguished yourself in the House of Commons, you've been, for instance, Home Secretary or Prime Minister even, that you should end up in the House of Lords because you've got, presumably, hopefully, some political wisdom. But the idea that people who never made it anywhere near there, but are political animals through and through, who've lived their life in politics, have anything much to add other than being a sort of B team of the House of Commons, strikes me as just being a very sad state of affairs. And all parties are responsible for it.
Yes, I remember last year when Boris Johnson's honours list came out and our colleague Freddie Gray turned to me and said, you failed when people younger than you start getting honours. I didn't expect that to happen quite so quickly to me. I'm 28 and one of these new Plaid Cymru peers is 27, so I'm over the hill.
And let's just, by the way, look at how distinguished or otherwise her career is. I haven't heard of her before, which is why I had to look her up. She is 27, Carmen Smith, and she never made it as an MP in Westminster. She never made it as a member of the Welsh Assembly. She was simply a political staffer in Wales. Now, I have seen cases before. There was a Lib Dem councillor who got elevated to the upper house some years ago, and I remember thinking, there goes the neighbourhood. But to have a Plaid Cymru MP, a staffer, sorry, I keep saying it in the expectation that she'd be more distinguished. The idea that a political staffer should end up there it is really an insult. And it's an insult not least, I mean, I'm sure she's perfectly nice. Well, actually, I don't know that. She's a Welsh nationalist. But I'm assuming she's perfectly nice. But among other things, she's obviously she cannot be distinguished in any way. And she's now got a job for life in the upper house. And, may she live a long life. But if she does, we're going to be paying for her to be in the upper house for maybe 60 years. And she will have a vote on legislation that affects all of us. And, the political parties bandy around stuff about reform of the upper house. They clearly never really mean it because they never really know what to do, as I've explained before in my column. But this is just party after party really demeaning the standing of the peers.
And you mentioned there one nationalist, Welsh nationalist, who is the only nominee. So I'm not sure what it says about the rest of the talent in Plaid Cymru. Wow. But you also go through, Douglas, some of the others on this list. Could you just talk us through them?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's one the Conservatives have put in who is a former MP, very undistinguished. He has edited a political website for the last 15 years, and now he's in the upper house. So he never made it to ministerial rank, but he did make it to a website, and now he's in the Lords. There's another person who was a perfectly nice person, who was an advisor to Harriet Harman and Ed Miliband. She's a couple of years older than me, James. Once again, somebody in her 40s in this case. So we might have her for another 40 years or so in the House of Lords. And she, I think it's arguable that Harriet Harman could go into the House of Lords one day. It's arguable that Ed Miliband could, given that he was a leader of the opposition and was, as Labour leader, was a terrific asset, of course, to the Conservative Party. But sure, Harriet Harman and Ed Miliband someday. But somebody who was an advisor to them, and who is, by the way, her main qualification that she touts of herself is that she was once named in 2017 by Ian Dale 75th most influential person on the left. Now, what is one to say, James? My point is not to insult any of these particular people. It's simply to point out these are all just political beasts of the nationalist parties, the Conservative Party, the Labour Party. They're all just political operatives. None of them bring anything to the upper house of experience in, for instance, small business or big business, or how to be a successful entrepreneur in the UK. They have no expertise in the sciences, in mathematics, in academia, in history, or anything else. They're simply all rather low grade, I have to say, political operatives. And so exactly what is it that they're going to bring to the deliberative process of the upper house? An upper house which already has, by everyone's recognition, far too many members, and which is now, I think, the largest legislative chamber in the world. I'm told it's even bigger now than the Chinese Politburo's official overseeing body. And I mean, maybe there's an excuse if you've got 1 billion people you're trying to keep in some kind of despotic rule. The idea that a democracy needs almost 800 peers in its second chamber seems to me not just ridiculous, but unbelievably wasteful.
And just as a final question, Douglas, you mentioned in the column that for you it's a hereditary earldom or nothing. I've got to ask, have you ever been offered a peerage of any kind?
I can answer you absolutely honestly, James. As I mentioned in the piece, there's always a risk when mentioning this. If as you will also have discovered, there are sometimes days, particularly if you're in Westminster ever, when you wonder whether or not you're the only commoner you know. I mentioned, of course, there are some people who would interpret that as sour grapes. They might be thinking, Douglas just wants to be Lord Murray. nothing less. And I explain why in the piece. I would definitely not be gunning for that. As I say, my response on the few occasions when I felt somebody playing political footsie with me, which is usually along the lines of hoping that you'll get in line in some way and not be bothersome or be independent thinking. My traditional line has always been the same. Yes, it's a hereditary earldom or nothing. As P.G. Woodhouse's Uncle Fred says, when you've got an earl, you're really onto something. Earls are hot stuff.
Well, for now, plain old Mr. Douglas Murray, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Heale.
Is NATO ready for a war with Russia? The Estonian Prime Minister, the Polish National Security Chief and Denmark's Defence Minister are all warning that Putin might be ready for a war with the alliance in the next 3 years. Spectator journalist Max Jeffery writes this week's cover a piece about the subject, and he joins me now alongside Jon Foreman, formerly Britain's military attaché in Moscow. Max, you've written for this week's magazine about the possibility of Estonia being invaded by Russia. You've been on the border there looking at some of the exercises being done. Tell us, what are the kind of drills being carried out right now?
Yeah, James, these are war games being practiced by Estonian, French, American and British troops in Estonia near Tapa, which is kind of near the top of the country, a bit in the middle, about a 2-hour drive from the border with Russia. And these are drills to prepare, and they're quite open about this, to prepare for a Russian invasion of Estonia. So the war game that I saw in particular was the Estonians versus the British, the French and the Americans. The Estonians defending 2 roads going north, and the British, French and Americans trying to attack them. They have tanks, artillery systems, they had an F-16 fighter jet, a helicopter, and these aren't using live ammunition, but they're using lasers, and they have sensors on their body armour to shoot at each other, and then you die, you come off the battlefield, and the games continue.
And Jon, how does this compare with NATO's previous roles and exercises over the past 40 years?
Well, certainly when I joined the Navy, our entire focus was on the Soviet Union, and our exercises were, and land, sea and air, all focused on Russia or the Soviet Union invading Western Europe. I think it was a period between 1990 around about 2014 where those exercises really got off the boil and we much more focused on deployments abroad, outside the NATO area. But so 2014 was a major wake-up call for NATO. And since then, I think over the last 10 years, there's been a whole new degree of realism break out inside NATO in terms of the command structures, in terms of the exercises, in terms of the regional plans that Max wrote about in his piece. So now you're seeing the fruits of those labour and also the investment the nations have been putting in terms of budgets. And the exercises that Max seen are not just replicated on that level, but as we'll see in Steadfast Defender across Europe, one of the largest exercises, land, sea, air, cyber, we've seen since the Cold War.
And Max, how well coordinated, Jon there talks about command structures, how well coordinated are all the NATO different forces and what you saw from the exercises?
Well, James, in terms of the interoperability, so the way that the different bits of equipment work together, the British, French, American and Estonian, that's what they're really trying to work on at the moment. They want to make sure that there is a seamlessness between the different types of equipment so that British tanks are communicating well with American planes, all this kind of thing. But there are some issues. For example, the French like to use their own equipment when they're in these war games. They don't like to use the British procured stuff, and vice versa. And it's the same with the Estonians. They're using their own tanks. So that's something that needs to be worked on. In terms of the communication, they say everyone gets on very well, and there's no language barrier. Obviously, everyone's speaking in English. And these exercises are really about making sure that when it comes to working together across different militaries, the communication is there. People know each other's faces. They understand the different characteristics of the way different sides fight. The Estonians actually seem to be a bit more gung-ho than the British, French and Americans like to be. So these war games are all about ironing those differences out and making sure that when it comes to the real thing, they feel like they're ready.
I mean, Jon, isn't that one of the main issues with NATO currently, is that different nations have a different sense of threat from Russia and are correspondingly much more willing to fight or not, and also invest in their armed forces. Of course, this week we've seen the big debate around 2% of NATO spending, President Trump treating it sort of like the equivalent of a membership club, almost saying, we're not going to protect those who don't spend 2%. Talk us through some of the differences in NATO in terms of both the military exercises approach, but also their approach to GDP spending as well.
Sure. So I think just on Max's point about interoperability, interoperability has been at the core of NATO since it was founded in 1949. And a lot of the stuff which goes on in the committees, the endless bureaucratic committees inside NATO, are to iron these problems out. So we have a whole collective range of standing agreements, STANAGs, which enable British radios to speak to French radios, which enable British aircraft to work alongside French aircraft, or stowed on the air controllers on the ground, or with the Americans. So what Max saw in Estonia is on the bedrock of decades of work in the committees and on the ground and those sort of things. I think in terms of spending, I think there's that new realism I spoke about since 2014 has been encapsulated in a thing called the Defence and Deterrence of the European Area, DDA, which all nations are signed up to. And I think you're seeing that trickle through into defence spending. So the Secretary General said this week that in the last 5 years alone, 11 countries have moved to 18 countries out of 31 now spending at the 2% mark, with more coming. Obviously we've seen Finland join, we've seen Poland rearming, we've seen Germany in particular, which I think is the first time since, in 2 generations, maybe 3 generations, actually reaching its target. So I think most nations have signed up to the perception that NATO is the most acute immediate threat, as the UK has, and that's trickling down through into budgets. But I think this takes a long time. NATO's like a super tanker. It takes a long time to change direction. But if you compare it to where it was 10 years ago and when Russia annexed Crimea, we've come a long way since then.
Max, give us a sort of sense, from being in Estonia, how much do they feel the threat of war there? Obviously, in some analysts would argue that Russia has lost half its military capability since the war in Ukraine began. How likely are they expecting a similar conflict to break out in Estonia? Everyone
says that it's a real possibility. Ordinary people say they feel quite worried about it. You have to remember that obviously Estonia is a very small country, and so they're not far from Russia at all. Many people in Estonia also, they'll speak Russian, especially close to the border in places like Narva. The armed forces say that they're ready to fight whenever. Their favourite phrase is that they were ready to fight yesterday. And to be honest, they kind of look like they are. But Russia has shown that it can fight a long war, as it has in Ukraine. It suffered big setbacks at the beginning, but now seems like it has something of the edge, even though it's sort of a bit of a stalemate. And so I think people are really worried that if the war in Ukraine comes to an end, that they could be caught unprepared. Estonia doesn't have a real air defence system. At the moment, they're all in Ukraine. They're waiting. They're in kind of a bit of a stopgap at the moment, really, while they're waiting for NATO to fill that in with some of the alliance's air defences. So people do feel vulnerable, and especially since the Estonian Prime Minister has said that Russia could be ready for conflict again, could be armed, ready for a war with NATO in the next 3 to 5 years. That's being echoed by other European leaders as well. The Danish Defence Minister said exactly the same time frame, around 3 years, and so did Poland's head of national security. So people really do worry about it.
And John, what do you make of those foreign policy analysts like John Mearsheimer, who argued that these kind of exercises are merely trying to antagonise Russia, have that effect, and that actually that was a key part of the reason why Russia invaded Ukraine 2 years ago this month?
Well, just go back on Max's point. Notwithstanding the perception of an increased Russian threat, which I think is fair, I agree with General Breedlove and Lord Robertson in his article that Russia does not have the capability or intent to attack NATO within the next 5 to 10 years. And I think we've seen the strategic disaster which would be visited on the Russian army in Ukraine has meant it been unable to capture cities within 15 kilometres of the Russian border, let alone march on Warsaw. So I think we have a sort of degree of take up deep breath, prepare for war if we want peace, and prepare for the reasonable worst case. But we shouldn't lull ourselves into the fact that the Red Army or whatever is going to be pouring over the Estonian border, notwithstanding the neuralgia and the anxiety which I'm sure the frontline states feel. I don't agree with Mearsheimer and those so-called realist school of foreign policy. At the end of the Cold War, Russia, we all signed up to the principles of the OSCE and the UN Charter that every nation in Europe has a right to choose its own security arrangements, its own alliances, and the right to choose. That's enshrined. And Russia's gone against that over the last 30 years by its actions. Russia signed up to that. It had various ranges of enlargement. Expansion is a Russian term. Enlargement is a NATO term. By the free will of these countries, so Poland, Hungary. I was in Hungary when it joined NATO. It was discussed with Russia at every stage. We had the NATO-Russia Founding Act. NATO stuck to that. did not base substantial forces east of Berlin. There were new political arrangements, new NATO-Russia Council. It's Russia which has really used the pretext, I think, of NATO enlargement as a sort of another whip to bash the West and try and blame us for its actions. Russia's actions in Georgia, Crimea, the Donbass, and now Ukraine is what led to NATO rearmament. It's what led to these exercises. It's Russia's behaviours in perhaps wishing to station new weapons in space, pulling out of the intermediate NATO nuclear forces, driving coach and horses through every treaty it's signed since 1990. That's what's caused the biggest shock to European security since 1945, and which NATO is there to prepare and defend us against.
And Max, it's going to be a huge year for NATO, obviously dominated by the fact that it's going to be the US presidential election. We've got the big NATO summit coming up in July. Did you get a sense from being out in Estonia of any sense of apprehension or concern about the future of NATO from talking to people there, or more broadly in the conversations that form the basis of your piece?
Interestingly, James, both publicly and privately, people sound quite okay, really, about the prospect of Donald Trump returning. I spoke to, as John says, I spoke to Philip Breedlove, who was formerly in charge of NATO's military operations. What he said was, look, it was rough last time Trump was in charge, but we got through it. He thinks that NATO, once again, will be fine. He thinks that Trump might kick up a bit of a storm, but more allies are spending their 2% figure on defence, and so Trump will hopefully keep quiet. And also, I spoke to the Estonian defence minister, and he said actually there was great cooperation with the Trump administration. He thinks that a lot of it is campaign talk, and perhaps that's completely true. But at the moment, they're more focused on just building up their own defences. And I think only time will tell whether these hopes are misplaced or not.
John, what do you make of that?
Yeah, but I think it was Trump and his administration which was the first to send offensive arms to Ukraine. The Obama administration didn't. People laughed at Trump when he went to Brussels. I was working in Brussels at the time when he arrived to the first summit, and he started demanding that people pay more money, and they all scoffed and laughed. And now they mostly are paying more money. 100 billion euros a year is going into defence more in NATO. So he did have an effect. But NATO is a political alliance, not a military alliance. So that's what you've got. But it's the Article 4 and the Article 5 terms of the North Atlantic Treaty, signed in 1949, is what's absolutely key. So you could have all the kit in the world, but if leaders are not prepared to stand by that commitment, that an attack on one is an attack on all, which Trump sort of intimated, if you don't pay your way, we're not going to defend you. That's what's caused a sort of a shockwave. And I think the Secretary General of NATO, Mr. Stoltenberg, his tone was unusual and very direct, that pointing out that that's how NATO works. We can't have two-tier memberships. We can't have nations being picking and choosing who they defend and can't defend. Now, some of Trump's advisors say he's got a thing against NATO. We'll have to see. I think it is campaign talk. And as people come close to the election, or if he gets into office, he'll probably likely to govern in prose rather than poetry in front of his electorate.
James, and also just to add, I think what actually worries some people in the alliance more than Trump is NATO's dependency on America still. We're very dependent on them for armaments, and also if we get into a situation where America is having to send arms to a conflict in Asia, then that's going to really be a problem for NATO. It relies on its strategic thinking. It relies on it in terms of the weaponry that it provides to the alliance as well.
Spectator contributor Owen Matthews writes a letter from Kyiv in this week's magazine. He says Kyivians are tired of the war effort and Iran-made drones loiter above the skies, but despite everything, the city is still fun and lively. To tell us all about that, Owen joins me now. Owen, you write from Kyiv for this week's Spectator magazine. What is life there like?
Kyiv is wonderful and strange and terrible, all at the same time. It's I've been going there for nearly 20 years regularly. The people are remarkable. The spirit is unbroken. That's the key thing, I guess, that we're going to be talking about, the relevant thing politically. But it's the strangeness is really, really hard to get one's head around, because it's a really fashionable, wonderful, beautiful sort of hipster city full of artisanal bakeries and cool bars and boutiques and things, and and fashionably dressed people, and then at the same time, sort of totally paradoxically, you have regular air raid sirens. You have the sound at night of drones coming overhead, which sound exactly like mopeds, which is what the Kyiv people of Kyiv call them, the Shahed drones. And you have missile strikes. You have drone strikes, which have killed people. Just in the last couple of days since I wrote the piece, in Kharkiv, there was a terrible fire that killed an entire family. People are being killed in their beds. And so you have this sort of completely striking dissonance between the reality of war, which is very clearly brought home to everybody by literally air raid sirens, World War II style. And at the same time, the shopping malls are full, the bars are full. Everyone is sort of leading a sort of semi-normal life. So there's a complete disconnect there.
And you write about how some people ignore the air raid sirens. What's their logical thinking?
Well, fatalism, mostly. I mean, if you spent your life, several friends of mine who shall remain nameless have taken care to make sure where's the nearest air raid shelter near the place where they're staying, and they all sort of charge into there at every air raid siren. But if you did that, then you would just lose a lot of your sleep. So actually, most Kyiv people, or at least most Kyiv people that I met, just sort of ignore them. Obviously, sometimes very much to their fatal peril. But I think it's just about playing the odds. You're in a city of millions of people, and the Ukrainian air defenses are pretty good. They found pretty efficient ways, certainly, of shooting down the Shahed drones, which are very destructive, but they're low, they're slow, they're relatively easy to shoot down. Other Russian missiles, like the Kinzhal, which are hypersonic, are much harder to shoot down. In fact, they're basically designed to be impossible to shoot down. But those travel so fast that actually, according to local law, who knows exactly how accurate this is, but that from detection of the launch to their hitting Kyiv, which is only about 150 kilometers from the Russian border, it's supposedly 90 seconds. So it doesn't really matter if you go to the shelter anyway. So the short answer to your question is, I think people are sort of have become pretty fatalistic about this kind of thing.
When you write the piece about it keeping a lively, fun city, and from some of what the comments you're saying there, it sounds a little bit like the Blitz spirit we had during World War II here in London. Is there something like that going on in Kyiv then at the moment? A sense perhaps of just trying to make the best of it in difficult circumstances? Some people are fatalistic, others seem presumably quite paranoid, and it's just about trying to muddle through, really.
Yeah, I mean, there's something infinitely sort of touching about it. I mean, you might think that it's kind of bad taste if you're a cocktail bar, to put up adverts on the nearby metro station saying our cocktails are powerful as a bomb. I mean, that might sound a bit crass, but actually, it's kind of brave. It is Blitz spirit, and the one thing that I noted in this in my piece is that actually, historically, bombing of civilians has very rarely actually worked in the last 80 or so years since it's been used. It definitely hasn't worked on Kyiv, no more than it worked on, didn't break the spirit of Londoners during the Blitz. It didn't break the spirit of the people of Coventry during the Blitz, and so on. And the same applies here. It's not really entirely clear why Putin is even doing it, because actually the one kind of concrete reminder of the war in Kyiv is these constant raids. If it were not for those raids, then lots of things might happen on the Kyiv political scene. You might see a return to opposition politics. But as it is, no one wants to criticize the government openly while the city's under attack.
I mean, you say all that, but also there is a sense in fatigue in Kyiv as well. 2 years this month since the war began. Tell us through what attitudes to the war are changing. Is there any support, for instance, for a deal with Putin and Moscow?
No, in a word. Not discernibly. And it's worth taking a moment to sort of unpack that. Or let's say unpack the opinion polls, because if you actually ask Ukrainians directly, like, do you want to do a deal with I was going to say Hitler, Freudian slip, but are you going to do a deal with Putin and give away land? They will all say no. So actually, the headline numbers are that Ukrainians, the vast majority of them, like sort of in 90% or over, are actually in favor of continuing to fight the war. But if you ask the question slightly differently, and there was a poll back in November that put a different question, slightly different question, and that was, do you think that compromise will be necessary to end this war? Then the numbers are very different. Then the split is like sort of 45 in that admit that compromise is necessary and 55 that oppose that. So actually, the question of how war fatigue is playing out is, again, an important one. I think people can simultaneously, because people are paradoxical, as you and I know from lifetimes of reporting, people can hold two contradictory views in their minds at the same time. So you actually find people who will actually strongly support Zelensky, strongly support the war, screw Putin and so on, but at the same time definitely do not want to themselves be mobilized or have any of their family members mobilized and crawl around in the snow with a rifle. So in that sense, actually, the focus of not so much opposition, but definitely sort of worry and war fatigue and concern is about the new mobilization drive. And actually, that's something that has become, for on the sort of grassroots level, something that people really talk about a lot, is how ridiculous it is that, so-and-so, Sergei, who has a sort of smokes 80 cigarettes a day and has a heart condition, is being mobilized. They're mobilizing the wrong people is a very common thing that you'll hear in Kyiv these days.
I wanted to ask about how the attitudes have changed towards that, increase in mobilization since Zelensky announced it. And also, in World War I, for instance, here in Britain, we had cases where men who were not at the front, who were in Britain, were presented, for instance, with the infamous white feathers to suggest they were cowards by some women here in England. Is there anything like that in Kyiv? Any kind of social or cultural pressures, as well as, of course, the law and forcing people to sign up? Is there anything like that in terms of a way of encouraging men to still enlist or trying to shame those who aren't seen in uniform? Anything like that at all?
What I would say is I haven't heard of any sort of white feather type activity, but there is actually a very deep resentment over what Ukrainians call the Monaco Legion, or do they call it the Monaco Brigade? I've forgotten. Anyway, it's all the sort of the wealthy Ukrainians that sort of got out and are now living in Monaco on their ill-gotten gains, which they've stolen in various ways from the Ukrainian people, and the resentment that there are wealthy Ukrainians living high on the hog while their countrymen are dying. Ukrainian men between the ages of 18 and 60 have been banned from leaving the country since the beginning of the war. Banned. That's why the vast majority of the refugees that you see in Europe are women and children, because the men just simply are not allowed to leave. And the exemptions for that are becoming harder and harder to find. And you mentioned the First World War. Britain, of course, never had a draft in the First World War. It did in the Second World War. Britain was able to raise enough volunteers, and Ukraine indeed was able to raise enough volunteers in the first months of the war. The draft, in other words, compelling people to get to the front, actually sort of kicked in towards the end of 2022, and it's just been sort of growing and growing. But the bottom line is that militarily, there's been a huge amount of debate and hand-wringing about the lack of American military aid, which is, of course, is essential to Ukraine making any progress in this war or making any severe sort of dents in the front lines. But actually, the real resource that they're running out of is personnel.
That's what I wanted to ask as well, was how prepared are the Ukrainians to fight without that support from America, given all the difficulties it's attracting right now in DC?
Well, one of the issues I don't think people are actually incredibly interested or knowledgeable about the metrics of military aid and what aid helps and what aid doesn't. But I think people who are slightly more militarily minded, there's a very interesting guy called Roman Kostienko. He's not actually an opposition politician, but he's head of the Ukrainian Parliament's Defense and Security Committee, and I speak to him quite often. So this is obviously a military guy. So Colonel Kostienko says that actually, the military aid that was provided in some numbers to support this summer offensive, essentially wasn't really what Ukrainians needed, and it didn't help them break through. That everyone can see. They got heavy main battle tanks. They got some armored personnel carriers. They got they got a sheaf of weaponry, but actually didn't help them break through. So it's not entirely as simple as if we give Ukrainians more kit, they will break through. Because so far the kit they already has not helped them to break through. Because they're fighting a war that no NATO war game scenario has ever anticipated. In other words, they're fighting a war without air superiority. The bottom line of every NATO and particularly American war scenario is that first you establish air superiority and then you go through. So there's no question of minefields in the American way of fighting war. You don't sort of fight your way across a minefield. You do air assault across the minefield, and that's how the Americans do it. But the Ukrainians can't do that. So the paradox is that actually Americans are trying to supply sort of bits and pieces for the Ukrainians in terms of armor and artillery and so on, but actually those are not things that have been successful, have so far proved successful in fighting this particular war, i.e. a war without air superiority. And establishing air superiority is basically impossible because essentially we have a situation where the sort of our research and development cycles of modern weaponry are such that air defense currently sort of trumps air attack. That's where we are at the moment. So short of actually transferring half of the actual US Air Force into the arms of the Ukrainians, you're never going to build up an air force powerful enough to overcome those Russian air defenses. On a moral level and on a political level, support from the United States is already massively important. But I think there's actually a growing sense that actually despair is too harsh a word, but a sense that expecting that the next summer offensive is going to be more successful than the previous summer offensive is already sort of slipping into the realms of sort of hopeless optimism.
Thank you very much, Owen, for joining us on Spectator TV this week. And finally, why are Italian restaurants in Britain so bad? Julie Bindel is on to explain. Now, Julie, you write about British Italian restaurants and really nosed on a Glaswegian restaurant you recently experienced. Tell us all about that.
I was in Glasgow working, had an evening to myself, went to one of the most revered Italian restaurants in the city. There are lots of Italians living in Glasgow and it's got a good reputation for its food. And I ordered bruschetta, which is what it should be, is toasted bread rubbed with a bit of garlic, drizzled in some proper fruity olive oil, and then some very ripe, sun-kissed, chopped tomatoes, a little bit of seasoning, and that's it. So it came to the table and I bit into it, and these tomatoes were pallid and they were fridge cold. Now, as I say in my article, putting your tomatoes in the fridge in Italy is a hanging offence. Here it should just be a maximum sentence of 15 years. But tomatoes in the fridge and in an Italian restaurant. So I said to the waiter, "Excuse me, but these tomatoes are cold." And he looked down his nose at me and said, "Madame, in Italy, we do not cook the tomatoes in the bruschetta." And I thought, oh, God. So I paid for whatever I'd had and went round the corner and had a curry. And it just made me think, really, do Italian restaurants even set up by Italians, run by Italians, owned by Italians, where the kitchen is full of Italians, can they get it right? And almost always the answer is no.
And you write also in the article this week, you compare it to, say, Greek restaurants. You've had lots of fantastic Greek food here in Britain, and even so it makes you think you're in Athens. But somehow the Italians in Britain, it's a bit different. Why do you think that is?
I don't know. I think partly it's because Brits might be used to two things, both which are inherently wrong when it comes to Italian cuisine. One is expecting that there's such a thing as Italian cuisine, in other words, pan-Italian, and there isn't. It's so regionalised. I mean, Italy is regionalised. The food is very regionalised, and you will know if ever you ask for balsamic vinegar, for example, in Milan, when really, if you ask for it outside of Modena, where it originated, you can probably just get away with it in Bologna, which is next door to it. But if you ask for it anywhere else, they'll look at you as if you're crazy, and they'll plonk down on the table the red wine vinegar or whatever acidic addition to the dressing that they favour. But the second thing that I think Brits get wrong is that they seem to think that if you're in an Italian restaurant, the food is going to be somehow primped up like in French restaurants. And the key success of Italian food is the ingredients have to be superb and as little as possible done to it. And I was thinking about this when I was reading a crime novel by a writer of Italian origins who always puts really good recipes in her novels. And you can smell the tomatoes and onions cooking, you can hear the pan sizzling, you can taste the food once she puts it on the table. You couldn't do that with French cooking, right? It would be, first of all, you weigh the flour. Then you have to get the butter and melt it to a particular... No, too fussy. So often what Brits want, and the Italian restaurant owners or chefs acquiesce to this, is too much fuss and too much done to the ingredients. And they don't import the ingredients from Italy because it's too expensive and too much trouble. So I understand why. And if those ingredients don't sing, then what you've got is over-fussed food that doesn't taste authentic.
That is fascinating. And I think you also put in the column about not just region, you say there about different types of Italian food, but also there's a sort of class element. There's poor food, which you talk about in the piece, talking about the way in which it's meant to be for more affordable types of food. Do you think perhaps that when it comes to Italian food here in the UK, we do it a bit differently and don't really have those kind of dishes that you talk about?
I think so, because Brits can be quite snobby about going to restaurants and expect something really special all the time, rather than the joy of going to a restaurant where you don't have to actually cook, serve yourself or wash up, and where you can sit in a very convivial atmosphere. And that's what restaurants should be. So they expect something a little bit different. And there's nothing better than bread and tomato salad. And if you say that to people, they'll say, what? A tomato and stale bread salad? Because any bread in an Italian recipe, such as polpa di pomodoro, which is basically bread and tomato soup, it's kind of like a mix between a stew and a soup, sounds horrendous. Stale bread? What? But actually it's a joy, because Italian bread, when stale, all it means is that it's gone hard and can absorb that delicious tomato juice. And so a salad made of fresh tomatoes, proper ones, of course, ripe, lots of freshly picked basil, some red onions, sweet red onion, and the dressing, which is, the whole point of it to absorb into the bread, is a thing of beauty. But it doesn't sound quite the thing. Similarly, with a soup made of grain, made of farro, made of the stuff that the French wouldn't even feed to the pigs, kale, is just something very special, because, of course, the Italians dress it with the most delicious of grassy flavoured olive oil, which makes all the difference. So I think what we give Brits in Italian restaurants is the fancy schmancy stuff that just doesn't work.
And I've got to ask you, Julie, have you spoken to any Italians in Italy about what they make of British Italian food and how the Brits do it?
I would never dream of doing that, because despite my strong views on this, even I might get offended. And particularly in regions such as Tuscany, where I think it's a bit like twinned with West Yorkshire, quite rude and brusque, I think I'd probably get a bit wary. And also there's kind of part of me when I'm in Italy and I hear somebody ask for a cappuccino after 10 o'clock in the morning, so they might want a cappuccino after lunch or even worse after dinner, because of course who wants to drink a huge cup of primarily hot milk on top of a heavy meal? I see the point, but I think the way that some Italian chefs and waiters go way too far in their rudeness, does annoy me. I mean, I was in this fantastic restaurant once in Bologna, which is known as the breadbasket of Italy, and the food is superb. And of course, it's known for its bolognese, its ragu sauce, which actually should go with tagliatelle, not spaghetti. And it was a place called Adolfo's. And the woman who was serving was clearly the proprietor, and her husband was in the kitchen cooking. And there used to be this tradition. It's thankfully dying a death now, because so many Italians died a death with cholesterol and obesity, of having not just an antipasti, but then a pasta, and then a secondi, a main course, and then a dessert, and then, of course, half a bottle of grappa. But in this restaurant, we had these kind of what I thought would be very light little antipasti mixture, followed by some pasta. And then I was supposed to eat the next course, so I left half of the pasta. And when the waiter came along to remove our plates and saw that I'd left some, she absolutely went berserk, to the point of where, when she served me the main course, I had to put half of it in my bag, and she snatched the plate away, not realising this, of course, and said, "Oh, I see. So she liked this course, did she?" to my friend who was fluent in Italian. I mean, that's too rude, but it's also very amusing.
Julie, hearing you talk about Italian food is fantastic. Thank you very much for joining us on Spectator TV today. That's it for this week. Once again, if you enjoy Spectator TV, do subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon so you never miss another episode. Thanks again for watching, and do join us again next week.